Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm LaShawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching. Today we are going to explore the topic of conflict. Eryn is doing a series on conflict in her church, and she's going to tell us a little bit about that and what has been coming up with that and what that looks like. And then we're going to have a conversation about what comes up from there. As is often the case in our episodes, it's organic and it just emerges and we see what happens. And of course, we're going to tie it into coaching, as is our theme in our podcast and in our episodes. So Eryn, can you tell our listeners about this series that's happening at your church and what brought it about and about conflict in general?
Yeah, this has been a project that we have been working on since last, I think, March, where a few of us within the church flew out to Michigan and took part in a Wayfinder training. That's the name of the training with the group, the Colossian Forum, which I know exists in Canada and the US, and I'm not sure where else. But the key to what we have been working on and praying about and learning about and trying to create community around is how do we engage conflict in a conflicted world, knowing that the world is consistently in conflict. How do we engage that in kind of a Christ-centered way rather than avoid it, or rather than disassociate or disengage, or rather than become very conflict-driven and fueled with anger and rage and all of those things that we don't necessarily want in our lives. And so this has been a very powerful learning for me. I mean, last March, I think we talked about this on another podcast, but just going out and learning about this curriculum and what it can do for communities, but even just me as an individual, I think it's been really powerful. And so one of the key takeaways from this curriculum was that we decided to kind of follow along with some of the key themes from the training. So I'm going to just share that really quickly here. And that is going Godward. So really trying to understand, what does the Bible say about conflict? And it was really neat because Rick, LaShawn knows Rick, he is the pastor at the Journey here in Longmont. He's a very authentic and energizing individual who really wants to engage his work thoughtfully. But one of the things he said this past Sunday was something around the fact that, I guess, Jesus was asked over, I hope I'm saying this right, over 183 questions and only answered 3 of them in the Bible. The rest were answered with a question. And the reason is really cool. The rest were answered with a question, not to manipulate people, not to learn more necessarily, but for connection, to really see the other individual in front of them. And when I heard that, I was just so, taken aback and blown away by the example that was provided in this conversation. So that's going Godward, for example. So the whole then curriculum follows getting curious, which is what I'm going to be teaching on Sunday to the group at church. Then we're going toward, where we listen with humility. We're going deep with other people, where we listen for people's fears and loves. And then we get right, where we repair missteps and misunderstandings and wrongs, whether intentional or non-intentional. And I just think that this conflict model could be used in so many different ways, obviously in the coaching context and the coaching process, but also within our communities, whether that's within a spiritual context or not. So there's so much richness here that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, you can hear the excitement in your voice. And also, I think it helps with conflict. I like that you mentioned, how do you approach, or how do you face conflict in a conflicted world rather than ignoring it, avoiding it, disassociating, or even joining in, meeting the energy, meeting with that same energy. How do you approach it? And I think that is something that is needed, because I think with conflict, people can either be, they can be a type of person who just like goes right into conflict, or meets with the same energy, or if you're anything like me, you want to avoid conflict, or it takes you a while before you can actually face it. There's a lot of things like processing and wanting to de-escalate, not wanting to add to the tension or bring more complications into a situation when there's conflict and when conflict arises. And there's also this sense that it's a negative thing, it's something to avoid, something that should be fixed right away. But there's also a lot of wisdom in it. That I saw that in what you said about what was it, 100 and more than 100 questions, I'll say, that were Jesus addressed with a question, which I think it speaks to coaching for one thing, getting curious, getting to like the heart of the matter. It's one thing to answer a question with like a statement, but when a question is brought to you and there seems to be more layers there, or there seems to be something behind that question, I think asking or responding to that with a question is a form of engaging and a form of connecting as well. So I see a lot in that, and there's so much value in even having the conversation. So I wonder, Eryn, you went to this thing in Michigan, you went to this training, you learned about this curriculum in March, you brought it into the church, and I'm wondering, this is new, right? This introducing the curriculum, correct?
Yes, correct.
What have you seen in your congregation? What have you seen shifting, or what things have come up as a result of implementing this curriculum?
That's a good question. And we're so new because I am actually the first skill building day next Sunday. So I think we'll see and learn a lot from what people have to say about that. In my own self, I have felt a lot of fear and like a prejudgment. Oh my gosh, we're teaching skills during service rather than listening to a sermon. How is that going to upend the traditional order of what we do, and how will people engage with that? And I have seen not only that fear in myself, but when we took this to the leadership team, a little bit of that fear too in the leadership team, because it is a risk to try something new, right? And it is a risk to bring other people into the speaking part of the church service that aren't necessarily a pastor or trained in spiritual formation, for instance. And so I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think the key to what is playing out here is this idea of skills and gaining more skills, because we can share through scripture or through other means all the ways to engage conflict. But until you have the opportunity to practice that or do it a little bit differently than you usually do, it's not really embodied. It's just one of those things that kind of is off to the side. Oh, I wish I would have engaged that differently, right? Or I wish I would have had the skills to try something here. And we're dealing with adults, and I'm dealing with myself as an adult. It's really hard to learn and engage these skills in a new and refreshing way when we have always done conflict, maybe in a way that feels aligned with our personality, a way that feels aligned with how we've done things. And so to ask people to do things maybe a little bit differently, ask myself to do things maybe a little bit differently, it is very vulnerable. It is very much so. And I really appreciate that one of the other key learnings through this is that we have taken, almost a year to make this happen. And that on Sunday, Rick set this up in a very aligned way with scripture, and he shared his own vulnerability in this process too. And I think just having somebody who can be an example of a leader in that way helps people feel more comfortable about trying something like this. And it's really about seeing the person in front of you and having a deeper connection with someone whom you disagree with or whom you don't see eye to eye with. And of course, in setting this up on Sunday, Rick brought up a lot of different things lately that he's read about, how people often want the same thing. They just see it in a little bit of a different way, right? And social media tries to pull us further apart than we actually are. So how do we navigate that as well? So there are these kind of big topics here too that I think really matter. And so by equipping people with skills, I think they have skills to then use within the social media realm, within their own day-to-day realm, etc. So we'll see. We'll see how people respond to this. This is a little bit of a risk. And I feel a little uncomfortable like going up there and doing this for my first time speaking at length in front of a congregation. But I think it's worth it. I think it's really worth it.
I love what you said about skill, because I think that is such an important piece, because we need to remember that navigating conflict is a skill. It's not something that we're born knowing. It's not an innate thing. People go to, school learning conflict resolution. There's mediators who specialize in conflict resolution, negotiators. So I think just the fact that there is a field in conflict resolution tells me that, hey, this is not something that you're just born knowing. And we need to remember that. And I think the fact that you're going at it from like a skills perspective, this is a skill, we're going to learn this skill and we need to practice this skill in a safe place. I think that's really important. And that reminded me of coaching and how we as coaches can provide a safe space for our clients who are dealing with conflict in their life. They can do role playing, they can brainstorm different strategies with their coach, and it would be a safe place for them to practice, because anytime you're learning a new skill, things are messy when you're trying new things. And like you were saying, Eryn, you can be very nervous when you're trying new things and you don't know the outcome because it's new, it's unfamiliar. And taking that risk can have wonderful rewards that come out of that risk. And of course, lots of opportunities for learning as well. And I'm curious, Eryn, where do you see your learning from the curriculum that you're learning about? Where has that influenced your life, in your personal life, in your coaching life? Like, how has this changed the way that you approach conflict, the way that you view conflict? How has it changed for you?
Yeah, I think I'll speak to the professional piece first, because when I was at CU, we brought in Christian Van Nuremberg, who's an expert in coaching, to speak with us and an audience about kind of coaching best practices. And one of the key takeaways during that conversation has stuck with me for, what has that been, like 7-ish, 8-ish years? I don't know. Is this idea of humility and humbleness as a way of being, as a coach way of being. And so when we work on our coach way of being ourselves, coming at things from a level of humility, it really does improve the coaching process. And that came up in yesterday's sermon a bit, this idea of this humility piece in conflict. And I think that really is something that I do really well with in coaching, but could do a lot better with in my personal life. And so being able to take some of these kind of key coaching concepts around humility with the skill building piece, I think, yes, that's something I use in my professional life, but I think it's something that I'm improving every day in my personal life. And that ties directly to values, like we talk about all the time, and how we can examine our values to align with humility, and how that is a little bit countercultural, definitely not in the social media age, those sorts of things. And of course, me as a middle child in a very large family, something I frankly have struggled with, because, seeking attention, those sorts of things have been a little bit of what I have done in some ways. And so I think for me, that has been a huge reminder of the humility piece, and how it is so fundamental to coaching as a profession. Going back to the professional piece with that fundamental piece of humility in coaching. And I think when Christian came and talked, that kind of shook up the group a little bit more. It's like, oh, yes, we need to learn all these things to be effective coaches, but we have to embody this. This has to be our coach way of being that is even more important, right, in a lot of ways than some of these other skills or other things. So I think that has been such a reminder through this process, and something I want to continue to engage, particularly with conflict, because it's so hard to have that humility and to ask questions. And again, to ask questions to connect, not to change someone else's mind, not to manipulate the conversation to work in your favor for your conflict, but truly out of a way of seeing the person in front of you and a way of connection. And I just really, really, really like that concept. And I want to keep growing in that and recognize that through conflict, there can be connection. And that's something else I think that's really showing up in this series.
I'm glad that you mentioned the piece about connection. I often, when I think about conflict, or when conflict is spoken about, or when we see conflict, it's usually it's in a way that it's dividing people and it's causing a lot of turmoil and distress. And so rarely do we look at conflict as a pathway to connection. And I do see that. I mean, when there's conflict, usually that is a way for us to evaluate or to look at our values. And then also when there's conflict, especially when it's in the context of friendship or in the context of a partnership and there's conflict, that does not necessarily mean that, oh, okay, we must sever ties. Oh, there's a conflict here, so therefore there's no way out. I think that it needs to be seen as a window into where we might see things differently. And then in positive intelligence coaching, we look at aspirations, or we look at, so there's a conflict here. Let's just take it down to a more surface kind of light level. Like, let's say you have 2 colleagues or 3 or 4 colleagues that want to go to lunch somewhere. And, one colleague wants to go to an Italian restaurant, another colleague wants to go to a Mexican restaurant, another one wants to go to a bistro or a pub or something. And so there's a conflict there. Very different cuisines, very different atmosphere. And so getting to the bottom of why the Italian restaurant, or why the bistro, or why the Mexican restaurant. Is it something about the food, or is it something about the budget, or is it something about the atmosphere? And that way you can come up with a common ground. So I think conflict helps us see where we're all, what we're all looking at. But oftentimes conflict can arise from a misunderstanding, from not really going into depth. And then if we go more into depth, we might find that the reason for these different choices can be resolved into one place based on the different things that each of the people is looking for in those specific restaurants. So let's say one person has a budget issue, another person has a dietary issue, and another person really likes eating outside. So you find a restaurant that has all of those things, and then you have resolved that conflict. So I know that's a very light surface area, a surface perspective of conflict, but it is an opportunity for us to learn more about each other. If we have a conflict, there is a way for us to ask questions, to get curious. And this also comes back to the humility piece, Eryn, that you mentioned. What is it about humility that can be a salve for strong emotions? Like, for example, if we look at something more personal or something that is a trigger for us, for example, when we talk about values, where one person might think we need to do something in this way, whereas another person might think we need to do something in another way. And it's easy to be focused on what's right. So if you think my way is right and your way is wrong. So when we get into the right and wrong and we're trying to prove to each other who's right and who's wrong, rather than wanting to reach an understanding or wanting to come up with a compromise, or but really it's about almost like a battle of egos and who's right, who's wrong. And then it gets into like when you get into morality. So I think that's where the humility piece comes in. I think if we're able to embody humility, and what is that? What does that mean to us? So for me, humility means I don't have all the answers. I'm willing to be wrong about something. I'm willing to learn. I may be right about a part of this, but maybe I don't have all of the information. So that's what humility is for me. Eryn, what is humility for you?
I like how you framed humility, and I want to answer that question, but there's something else that I want to go back to, and then I'll answer that question. And your example of the restaurants and how you circled back in on that example as a way for connection, a way for people to learn more about maybe each of these individual specific needs that they had no idea about, right? That's fostering connection, and I really like that example. So I wanted to point that out. Humility for me is everything that you said. I really, really like how you frame that. And it's, I think, the ability to also self-examine one's strengths and flaws and be okay with those, having both, right? And holding space for both, and knowing that I am a flawed human just as the next human is, next to me, and that while there is that kind of nature, that condition of being a human, I think with that humility being the foundation of that, that's where love and grace kind of can grow out of. I think that's where more love for each other and that, I think, is something that comes from humility. And so I think that's really helpful in this conflict conversation and moving with conflict. And I know I get most challenged and need more learning around when it comes to conflict with people maybe you have been in long-term relationships with, you're closest to them, right? There's so much more history. There's a much more storied past. And there are certain key patterns to the conflict that have gone on unchecked for multiple years. How do we or how even personally do I navigate that from a stance of humility and also a stance of using specific conflict navigation skills? Not that we have to resolve anything, and that's not the end goal. Going back, the goal of conflict isn't to have a right or wrong or a resolution, but it's going back to having that connection. And I think this ties back to your question about humility, because with humility, I need to have the strength to engage this individual in a way that doesn't come off as like, oh, I know everything. And at the other end does come off as like, we do have some things to work on. So I don't know, like as I'm kind of thinking about humility in that sense too, this is where this is leading me. And this is where I often feel the most challenged by those, long-term relationships that have a history of not the best conflict patterns. So how do you switch that? How do you start to make some change in that? Yes, from a level of humility. Yes, from having skills. I don't have an answer there. And that's where I need the most work, I think. I definitely need that support.
Well, when you look at long-term relationships or relationships where you have a history, and you mentioned patterns as well, I think it's easy to take for granted that predictability, to convince ourselves or to hold on to that narrative that we never change. that if I've known you for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you're the same person that you were 20 years ago. You're the same person that you were 40 years ago. Yet we know that we're changing, that I change, people change in our lives. And even if we've known them for many years, or they're our parent, or they're our child, our sibling, our spouse, it doesn't mean that they're not changing. And I think we do ourselves and the people we love a disservice when we hold this false narrative that the people we know the most and the longest are the same, because we can rely on them. They're familiar, they're predictable, but are they really? And have we really taken the time to ask? I remember, for example, I'm going to go to a lighter example here, with my kids. There are certain things that they like, food that they like. And I know that they like that food, and they've liked that food like forever, right? So, for example, my son is a peanut butter and jelly kid. He loves peanut butter and jelly. That's his go-to. And you get into this routine, you get into this pattern of, okay, James wants something to eat, peanut butter and jelly. The other day, we were looking at we buy a lot of bread because he loves peanut butter and jelly. And we're like, wow, we haven't been going through bread for as much as we normally do. And I took a pause and I'm like, when was the last time James had peanut butter and jelly sandwich? When was the last time he had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And then we had a conversation with him, and he said, my 10-year-old, he said, oh, I'm trying new things. I'm not just eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches anymore. And it's like, you're right. We have this old narrative of James as the peanut butter and jelly kid, and he's not doing that anymore. And so we have all this bread and nothing to do with it because we bought into the false narrative that our son, if he's going to be the peanut butter and jelly kid for a year, 2 years, he's always the peanut butter and jelly kid. But he's not. And he reminded us, no, I'm not the peanut butter and jelly kid. So I think it's easy to get into this habit of seeing the people that we see every day as static, as just that you're 10 years old, but I see my 6-year-old instead of my 10-year-old, or you're 15 years old and I see my 5-year-old, but my 5-year-old is my 15-year-old, and they change, not only do they change in appearance, but they also change in their thoughts, what they've learned, what they like, what they dislike, what they're trying, what they're not trying. They become braver, and they even develop fears that they didn't have before. And I think if we can be mindful of that and aware of that, and even bring that to ourselves too, the person that I was 5 years ago is different from the person that I am today. I've had experiences, I've learned new things, I've changed my mind on things, I've gotten new information, and therefore I'm not the person I was 5 years ago. And I think if we hold that in our mind, when we have conflict, when conflict arises, we can take that time again to be humble and also to be curious. Oh my goodness, wow, I just said something that that person who always agrees with me when I say this thing doesn't agree. Ooh, what happened? How did that person change? Or let's learn more. And then I want to also circle back to what you said, Eryn, about the purpose of conflict, or something that we can get out of conflict, which is connection. And if we hold that as our reason or our purpose for interacting with each other is connection, then we're going to lean towards giving people the benefit of the doubt, giving each other grace, seeing each other as, equals, rather than seeing a reason why this isn't going to work out, or you're not like me, or we're too different. But if we're really looking towards connection, if we're saying, I interact with my fellow humans to connect, then when conflict arises, we might be more open to giving people the benefit of the doubt, and listening and learning and finding out something new, even if it's someone we've known for years. Any thoughts, Eryn?
Yeah, at the end with that listening and learning, those are kind of the skills we're going to be working on next Sunday around how do we listen, how do we ask questions well, how do we give feedback. Feedback is hard because it is extremely kind because it keeps us from making assumptions, and we have information checkpoints, and we also are kind by giving somebody feedback they would have went throughout their entire life not ever hearing or having. We do not live in a culture that gives feedback. It's slamming them on social media, talking about them behind their back or whatever, but not taking the brave approach to saying that direct statement of giving feedback, of course, from a place of caring and warmth and a place of connection. So yeah, I'm really excited about those skills and how that relates. And then as you were talking, I love your example with James of the peanut butter and jelly, and how when we make assumptions, that leads to maybe miscommunication, conflict, and then lack of connection. And so by you taking the time to really sit with James and be like, okay, you don't like this anymore. Let's learn more about where you're at in your life right now. Who are you? That sort of thing. I think that is really powerful and really is a good example for your own kid, for James, to learn about conflict. And maybe even going back to him like, hey, this is a good example about conflict and how we just navigated this. And I think that is the other piece that this is leading to in my mind, is that it's a process, right? Like, this isn't a one and done thing. This is a continued process of staying in relationship with someone else, because that is what you're choosing to do, but also from a place of humility. And it's a way to engage relationships that are long-term through through engaging conflict. And that was a question that came up actually at church when Rick started to introduce this series. People had questions like, is conflict good or is conflict bad? Like, what does it say? Well, he did look at it. There is a passage in the Christian Bible that talks about how conflict is actually a bad thing, which you wouldn't think would be the case necessarily. But it's all because of, the fallen kind of sinful nature of the world, not any one individual within the system itself. So we are constantly navigating conflict because it is there all the time, right? So like, it is a constant and it's not going away. It's just a matter of what can we do within that to live a better life for ourselves, for our children, for each other. And so that is a process, and it takes time and effort and engagement and missteps and mistakes and everything that the human condition, allows for. But when you have the intentionality and have the skills, I think it makes that process much more peaceful, much more caring, much more kind. And I think that's the process that we want to engage in. I think humans want that deep down. I'm scared, though, that we now live with this social media world and everything like that in a world that pushes conflict, where people think that conflict is, something that always has to be a part of their lives in a way that is moves people away from each other. And I don't know, that weighs on me a little bit, because at the end of the day, I think there is like this deep down yearning to be acknowledged, to be cared for, to care for other people. And that goes back to having this process to engage conflict in a way that is meaningful, in a way that doesn't draw us apart.
That's a really good point. That really stuck out to me, what you said about this culture of seeing conflict as indicative of just a mutually exclusive, that we cannot live in the same world if we have conflict. That seems to be like kind of the extremes of like social media and the way that people are engaging when conflict arises. So for example, if someone has an opinion about a current event or something that happens, and it is a a different opinion than the other person, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, this is a sign that we can never get along, or we can never see eye to eye. And one thing that came to mind when you were talking, Eryn, is the power that we all have to co-create new ways of being. And if we can, I mean, in your congregation, you are co-creating a new way of being. And that is going to branch out to the sphere of influence of each of the people in your congregation. As they learn these skills, they can then pass this on to their children, their friends, their loved ones. And that's how we can rewrite the narrative or change the trend that's happening on social media, and in other spaces where we gather and we connect or not. I think that's something that we can do with the people that are in our network. So if we can change the way that we engage with people, or we can model and embody humility, connection, a desire to learn and to be curious, then the people around us can also learn and follow suit and approach and engage in conflict in different ways. So I think that gives me hope in what you were saying, Eryn. That gives me hope. And this is really interesting. Hopefully we can revisit this and you can give us an update in March or, somewhat, as this develops in your congregation and even in your life as well, as you engage in these skill building activities where you're really looking at conflict and how we can navigate conflict in a more compassionate way. So I think it feels like we're very close to coaching nugget of wisdom time. And I would say that for me, a coaching nugget of wisdom would be, I really like the idea of embodying humility, embodying connection. So I would enter in a question for our listeners, maybe even like a question. This is really curious in terms of, how do you see conflict? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Do you see it as something to avoid, something to take head on? How do you see conflict, and how is it showing up in your life?
Such a good question. I guess I'll say, listen to the person who is talking to you next and really pay attention to what they're saying, who they are, their tone of voice, what they look like, and find that as an opportunity to make connection.
Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Mayshell's Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.